worry. Turned out, when he died, he had 32 credit cards. And you know, when you see that, you do wonder, I mean, what is life about today within our capitalist system? And I would want to distinguish, I think, the whole sort of postmodernist culture, the zeitgeist and so on, from the system, because I can see the system having very different kind of philosophies which imbue it, and very different kind of people.
But Brian, I'm not going to let you get away with that, because the capitalist system, you can have different capitalist systems, but don't you think the capitalist system to some extent requires the creation of desires and the creation of the credit to feed those, to give people the means to feed those desires? And where it's sort of it doesn't quite seem to be working. Typically, for example, today, Germany, where people just simply are, everyone says they're not consuming enough, they're saving too much, they're not spending enough. God, you can't, they don't even have credit cards, they only have debit cards, and that's so stupid because everyone's going to, don't they see how clever we are in America and the UK? It's not a sort of contingent part of the system, but the economic success that we talk about here relies on all the things that you're saying you would rather put aside. The over-borrowing and the debt problem. The system relies on there being a lot of us borrowing money. And if you've got a lot of people borrowing money, you're going to have 3 million people who can't repay it. And you can't sort of have it both ways, can you?
Well, first of all, with the 3 million people, I think at present that we have a rather loose regulatory system for subprime lenders in Britain. And we could certainly do a lot more to deal with that issue. Secondly, let's take, you say that in a sense it's the artificial creation of desire and so on. Well, you know, I use an electric shaver. I prefer to use an electric shaver than wet shaving. Our kitchen at home, it's a bit like a factory. You know, there are a whole lot of different gadgets in the kitchen. But, you know, we like that. I mean, I would say that to me, that is sort of progress. I sit on the board of a company in America called ServiceMaster, and one man who's been on the board for the last 12 years with me was the chief operating officer of Walmart, which is now the largest company in the world. And you know, it started in the middle of nowhere in Arkansas, in a place called Bentonville, with this man who said, why can't people who live in the country have the same sort of prices as people who live in the cities? And he said, you know, let's get a store, let's pile things high in the store, and let's go for the lowest prices. And this man on the board, he's the only man on the board who asked the following question. How as a company, he says, can we reduce our prices? Now, I think that's a great question to be asking, because you're asking, how can we help the poor? Or the least disadvantaged? I don't see that as materialism ever. I see that as, I mean, if you read Sam Walton's autobiography, you know, he was really public-spirited. And he made a fortune.
Okay. What I really want to do, because I have dominated and I've let them dominate even more, I'd really like to take 2 or 3 comments or questions from the floor, because it's opening up a bit. So we'll take the gentleman here with the up first, then we'll take the guy in the row behind. So you two go first. Let's take the mic so we can make sure everything here. Tell us who you are. Okay,
yeah, my name is Momtaz Ayub. I used to work in investment banking, but I found that was affecting my quality of life, so I'm now a teacher. I wanted to comment on something that Brian mentioned about how this system resists shocks, but of course we don't have an alternative, for instance, Islamic-based system, which perhaps would be better at resisting shocks, and I would argue that perhaps our current system is quite susceptible to speculation and various things that are not based upon the real economy, and hence, you know, as they say, when, you know, America sneezes and the effects it has on the whole economy and so forth. But I had a question for Tariq, which is related to wealth, because wealth, generally speaking, over time it decays. If we have any kind of product or any good, over time it will decay and its value will decrease. Businesses sometimes fail, but interest always increases, and it's kind of inexorable and it always goes higher and higher, whereas it seems to me that the reality of the economy is different to that. So does that not have an effect on society as a whole? Could you perhaps comment on that?
I'm going to hold that thought. I'm going to go straight to the guy very behind. Yep. Go ahead. Let's just get a few comments.
Just two simple questions. First one is about how do we differentiate between usury and interest. I think one of the things you mentioned by number. Or somebody working in Goldman Sachs in an executive position, he can afford to take 30% interest. Somebody who earns £10,000 a year, 5% can be too much. So how do you draw the line that which one usury and which one isn't? Because the person who decides the interest rate, they're the rich ones. Second question, the whole market of credit cards, it runs based on the assumption that there are n number of people who is going to default, and we are going to charge them very high rate of interest. Don't you think this is, interest-based system is encouraging to have a kind of environment where poor people are becoming victim of these kind of circumstances?
Do you have a credit card?
Yeah, indeed. Unfortunately, we have to live in this society. So.
Okay, I mean, you don't have to really do, because you can just not have a credit card.
Well, I think thing is that when you want to buy a house or you want to buy something, car or something like your credit scoring will be checked, and if you don't, you don't have a good credit history, you will be denied.
Well, obviously,
yeah. So it's part of the whole system, but basically you get caught in it. So these two questions.
Do you feel a victim though, or do you feel?
It's not a victim, but you heard a lot of stories in BBC. How these people got ripped off, this much credit card, this much that. But I think, I mean, don't you think this internet-based system is encouraging this to have this kind of business environment?
Another comment from the floor. Should we take the chap at the front here? That would be good. Just wait for the mic. We'll get it over to you. Just jot down whatever points you want to answer or comment on. We'll just get a few more. And then we'll go right to the back. Yes, go ahead.
My name is Iqbal Nassim. I'm a student. My question is to Lord Griffiths. It seems that so far in the discussion, every time sort of major problem with the current system is pointed out, you seem to have sort of suggested solutions within the current system. And kind of be, are you reluctant to sort of just nip the problem in the bud? Do you think we've just gone so far down this road that it is actually impossible to sort of bring about a system, an interest-free system? So is that where your reluctance comes from? Because it seems that the sort of proposals so far have been a bit okay. We'll increase regulation within everything happening within the system. Do you feel actually that there is no hope of any other system?
Let me just ask you though. The premise of your question, which is very much have you stopped beating your wife, is that the current system is broken. And that's why you might entertain a really radical alternative. Now, Tarek clearly thinks the current system is seriously broken. Yeah. Could you not argue that we do all right, actually, by standards of human history? We're well provided for, and maybe that's got something to do with the system. It's not that bad, wouldn't you?
Yeah, I suppose you can look at it from two perspectives. If you look at it from the Islamic perspective, then obviously you're trying to get out, even, it doesn't matter how high your standard of living is or whatever, you're still trying to get out of it because you feel it's wrong. But even from a non-religious perspective, there are lots of issues which have been pointed out, which, whether you're religious or irreligious, you can still, identify that those are problems. And perhaps some of those problems can be solved with a radical, and what seems to be a radical solution.
But let me put the question a different way, because I want to know where you're coming from. Do you think society is currently a mess and awful, or do you currently think, actually, we're quite well off and it's all, life is good? I mean, are you sort of thumbs up or thumbs down?
Well, I think materialism, on a material level, you can say thumbs up if you're just going to analyze it only from a material perspective. But if you analyze all the deeper levels, on the spiritual perspective, on people's motives, intentions, on people who are actually suffering as a result of the system, then obviously I think it's quite clear that there's lots of
it's past. Yeah. Okay.
Yeah, there's lots of problems.
Okay, we'll take one more. I said at the back. There's a gentleman right at the back. Stand up. Yes. Go back there. We'll take that one, and then I'll throw open the panel, and then we'll have a couple more questions.
Yeah, just a comment. My name is Haytham Al-Haddad. Okay, the comment is, according to the statistics, the national debt in the last 5 years is equal to the national debt that we gained for the last 300 years, which is really astonishing. Now, many people are looking for a solution. Let me propose a solution for everyone, especially for maybe ladies or for married men who don't want their ladies to spend a lot of money. I think once we receive our wages, and instead of using this evil credit card, this evil plastic card, let us take the money, okay, let us take like £500 in cash in the beginning of every month and start spending from that money. Because here I think there is a psychological basis, okay, or understanding for the situation. Once you spend money and you touch the money and you feel that the money is going out of your hand, you want to spend a lot of money. That's why I'm promoting the dinar, the golden dinar, because once you have the dinar in cash in your hand, okay, you won't be thinking of spending more than what you have in hand. That's why the people who like to enslave people and to put people in debt, they said, oh, hang on, there is a psychological issue around it. So let us substitute this physical gold with paper money. Then after a while, people start feeling the paper money as their own wealth. So then they said, okay, hang on. Now the people are starting feeling that as the physical money. So let us use the credit card.
I think we get the point. But you're disagreeing with Tariq then, because Tariq thought you could have your dinar system with checks, electronic things, and plastic cards, presumably.
He's a friend of mine, but yeah, I disagree with him. I disagree with him in that particular point.
You're a real purist on the hub. Can I stop you there? Because I want to get them a couple of comments, a couple more from the floor after they've commented, and then yes, comment on any or all of the above points. Briefly,
Can I say, I'm not opposed to an entirely different system. I'm not at all opposed, in principle, to an Islamic system. I mean, I don't feel that the payment of interest is immoral. I think our present system has flaws. I think some of those flaws can be remedied by various proposals like the sort of things we make in this report and so on. But I'm not, I mean, if somebody came along and said, look, there's an Islamic system here, it'll work, it's terrific and so on, I'm open-minded. I mean, if a system like that really works, after all, the Christian Church believed in a system like that for about 1,550 years. So I have no problems with that. The problem that I would then raise is the following, however. Why is it that we have interest? What's underlying it? What kind of drives us to have an interest rate in society at all? And I think two things. The first is that the productivity of investment, you can invest and you can make money. And secondly, that people, time preference, people prefer money today to tomorrow. Those seem to be, they come from Irving Fisher in the 20s, they seem to be two sort of things. So, this is not my problem. If you said, in that situation, let's have an Islamic banking system, what we discovered as Christians when we had this system was that people got around it. And you made 3 transactions. Instead of paying interest, you made 3 transactions simultaneously. And the 3 transactions simultaneously were equivalent to the payment of interest. And my suspicion, my question, I don't want to be sort of awkward, or I don't want to, the last thing I want to do is to in any way undermine your faith in your religion. This is my intention. But the question that I'd ask is, to what extent Islamic banking is really devising a way round of effectively paying interest? And I think that's a very hard question to answer. And I think it was in relation to that it was Calvin who actually said, well, look, this thing is not immoral in itself. Otherwise, Jews couldn't lend to non-Jews. But let's call a spade and say, you know, this is really what we're doing. So that would be my question to you.
Good point. I'm going to give Tariq a chance to answer any or all of the above.
Well, I think first of all, on the philosophical level, wealth is not an objective for Muslims. It's a means. The objective of life is to worship the Creator. So wealth, you know, isn't as it is today. It's become the means, it's become the objective, if you like. The objective is to maximise shareholder value, you know, with selfish economic agents who just want to maximise our wealth, and this is completely foreign to us. But you can't legislate away from people who don't want to be good Muslims or good Christians. And I'm reminded by Sheikh Al-Laki, I think, who mentioned very well that when the prohibition of alcohol came in Arabia 1400 years ago, that the people simply cracked their bottles and the wine was flowing in the streets. They didn't say, oh, but hang on, can we get around it? They just cracked the bottles and it was over with, done, because they believed. And you compare that to prohibition in America, where prohibition came, everyone was working out how they could bootleg and make a bit on the side. So people didn't want to believe, they didn't want to do the thing. And you can't have Islamic finance if you don't have Muslims. And indeed you can't have Islamic banking if you don't have Islamic money. If you've got interest bearing money, you cannot have Islamic banking. And that is the problem. In fact, I would say that Islamic commercial banking is a creation of the interest-based banking system. I've heard as much from directors in let's say Islamic banks that have been created as windows from interest-based banks. They've said that we're doing this as a defensive measure. Islam is just an ideological threat. We've got no military force, no economic force really, but we have an ideological position, which is that any 0.1% interest is prohibited. So we don't have thresholds or anything, it's just prohibited. Now, how do you do business? I just have two points. How do you do business? You invest and you share the risks and the rewards of your investment. If the entrepreneur you finance makes a loss, you as a financier make a loss. If he makes a profit, you make a profit. And this is exceedingly important because what it does is tie the real economy to the financial economy. You don't have a bunch of bankers sitting there saying, your crops failed, your industry went down the pan, but we still want our interest. They say, you failed, we did bad project planning, or God gave us a bad result, whatever they might say, and we're going to share your loss. Which means that you don't have the debts piling up while the country is underperforming, while the businesses are going bankrupt. And if you did, then those debt figures wouldn't be there.
And in essence, what you're doing is talking about replacing the banks with unit trusts.
Yes, I am all in favour of having, let me say, quasi-equity type financing, venture capital type financing, where the risks and rewards of the underlying business are shared. There are certain requirements on that. There are questions over such things as how limited liability should operate, for example. But that's the basic.
But in a sense, that's quite that is a practical way of seeing how you would build a system in which I as someone who might want to save a bit, to share the risk with some
But this has been promoted for 20, 30 years. It wasn't taken up. That's the point. The system rejected.
Actually, the Americans have gone quite a long way down, taking savings out of banks and putting them into...
But the banks haven't done it themselves.
No. Okay, we're going to take two more points. I'm sorry, I do want it to wind up before 10:30. And I'm going to take the gentleman here, and then the gentleman with the white paper there. So I'm sorry I would take 2 points, and then I'm going to let the speakers wind up. So yes.
Okay. Thank you. Thank you. Hello, my name is Rowan Barclay. I'd just like to fill in some of what Brian suggested about religious history. I think he was perhaps a little cursory in talking about justice in relation to Deuteronomy. Because what it's saying is, you shall lend to other nations, but they shall not lend to you. It actually says that further on in the chapter. It says, if you obey my commandments, then you shall lend to other nations, but you shall not borrow from them. Whereas if you don't obey my commandments, you'll end up having to borrow from them, right? You'll be the victims. So what we're talking about is loans at interest as a means of international competition. Now, when the Christians came along, they defined themselves, the whole Christian ecumeny, as the equivalent of the Jews, and they said, we will not have loans at interest amongst ourselves, right? And this meant that there was no economic development in the modern sense, because there was no incentive, there was no opportunity for exploitation. When the Calvinists came along, they wanted to put themselves in the position of the Jews vis-a-vis all the other Christians. They wanted to actually start lending at interest to other Christians as a means of gaining domination, just as the Jews supposedly had in Deuteronomy. Are you with me? So where is the justice there? I mean, it's within the chosen community, but it's not just as vis-a-vis them compared to everybody else. It's systematically unjust, because they're aiming to exploit the nations around them by means of economic imperialism. And the question is, who's going to do that in the modern world? It's not the Jews, obviously. It's presumably the Calvinists.
Sorry, who's going to do what?
Who's going to do the international lending at interest? Who has the religious sanction? They're not going to lend to one another, but they're going to lend to the out-group and exploit it. Do you see what I'm getting at?
Well, there are enough irreligious people to pick up that function. Let's take the last point over here. And the guy right. Yes, Chris Cook. This is the last one, and then I'm going to do two sentences down.
Chris Cook. I think to me there's a fundamental issue that underpins all this, if you're looking at morality, and that's sharing of risk and reward. To me that's what underpins this whole debate when it comes to values. And I think we have to distinguish, there's again a grey area here. There's investment on the one hand, where there is no obligation, equity as we know it, shareholder value equity as we know it, investment where there's no obligation to repay, and then there's debt where, if you like, it's time to pay, it's credit. And we distinguish the two. I mean, I don't think anybody has a problem with the return on capital, a return on investment, but the issue arises because of the imperfect sharing of risk and reward. The fact that the creditor wants his money back whether or not the person to whom he's lent it is in a position to pay. And that's an issue. The return on capital is a bit of a red herring. Now, what I'm pointing out in my writings, etc., and my observations, is that there is, in fact, an emerging alternative. It's not a million miles away from what Tarek was talking about, unit trusts. A way of sharing risk and reward, which is fundamentally Islamically sound. And that basically takes new legal structures and applies them. I'm saying there is no such thing as the public sector borrowing requirement. People say, you're bonkers. And I'm saying, well, imagine you take a school, you take a piece of land, you go to school, you divide it into 1 million units on a unit trust, but not using a unit trust, and you find investors in the return and a reasonable capital rental, as I call it. I call that a capital partnership. It is now possible. It has been done by the Hilton Group. The second thing is, there is a way of actually mutualising the creation of credit. A clearing union is what I think Moeen was referring to. If we actually have in this room today, we agree, okay, we will bilaterally extend credit to each other and have a mutual guarantee. Well, that's what the London Clearing House basically does. And we have credit creation mutually, but without the bank as the intermediary. With the Clearing Union Guarantee Society, and the Guarantee Society is part of Scott Lib Dem policy now, as you know, the idea I put forward is being adopted by the Scott Lib Dems as policy, and the Iranians are actually using the Guarantee Society idea as, again, in the work I'm doing. So I'm pointing out that there is an emerging alternative based upon sharing of risk and reward. And that's what I'm interested in promoting. Sorry, I went on.
Tarek, a very specific comment. Something like, in fact, a friend of mine in Brazil told me in their very inflationary days, the way if you wanted to buy something and you couldn't afford it, you joined a club, a car club, you would pay in a subscription month after month after month. Every month, the club would buy a car, and by lottery, would give the car to the person who won the lottery. And everybody had to keep on paying, whether they had the car or not, had to keep on paying to the end, and by the end everybody had a car. So they had converted a stream of payments into a number of cars for a cluster of people. Is that okay? Or is that a sort of finding your way around?
There's an element of kind in there, uncertainty, and if you want to follow Islamic contract law, you pay a price, you must know what the good is you're buying, and you must specify the time of delivery under most contracts. But I think well, there may be some Sharia scholars who say you can get the car, at an undefined time, but the word lottery is you're in Islamic finance.
What I'm going to ask Ahmed, Brian, I'd like to make some final comments and pay off, and then we'll let Tarek have the last word.
Can I say again what a pleasure it is to be here? I think underlying the debate this evening has really been something which is, I think, almost excluded from most debate. I mean, these are not issues I could easily raise in Goldman Sachs, which is the whole ethical dimension of the economic system in which we live. And I think anyone who raises that question, whether it's a Jew, a Muslim, a Christian, or a secularist, I think they're raising a very important issue. And I feel at the heart of the issue there is the question of what do we understand by justice. And you know, I go back to some Christians who are entrepreneurs. Cadbury built up Cadbury's to what it is today, Sir George Cadbury. He built Bourneville, a special little small village town there. He built places there for his workers to live in. You go to Port Sunlight, where Lever did exactly the same. I was yesterday with a Chinese entrepreneur who's been very successful in biotech, and he's wanting to get me involved in sub-Saharan Africa with setting up a fund, a social enterprise, private equity fund, where people will put in money and you won't target an equity rate of return, but you hope you get your money back. And so far, we find there's a lot of interest in it. In other words, to go one level above microfinance in really poor countries. And to me, the whole concern, to me, the major thrust of our thinking is how do we improve in a way marginally? I mean, you can present an ideal out there, a theocracy with a totally different world. That to me is interesting intellectually. But the question I ask is, and the question we have debates in the House of Lords is, how can we actually try and improve the system that we're in? That's one conclusion. The second conclusion is, you know, Jesus said, because there's a lot of teaching in the Gospels about money, and he said that you had to choose between worshipping God and what he called mammon. So he deified and personified money. And he said it's a god. And I think the debate over systems, which I love to do as an academic, and have been doing in a way all my life, playing games, is terrific. But at the end of it, what is fundamental is the people who are running the system. And that's you and me. And that is an appeal ultimately to faith. So I think at the end of the day, you know, when I study something or write something, whatever, ultimately the spotlight is turned on me and says, well, what are you living for? I mean, are you just living to make money? Are you working 18 hours a day? You know, what really makes you tick as an individual? And that's why I'm so excited to be part of this debate tonight, because there I think we really are in, I have to say in our society, maybe in a minority debate, but I think it is a fundamental debate.
Thank you, Brian. Tarek, summarise, answer back.
Well, you know, it's taken several hundred years for the system to come to what it is, and the time it gets, you know, an hour and a half to challenge it. But there will always be famines and wars and disasters of that kind of the world, and we're always going to have to face them. We don't need to create extra problems for ourselves. We don't need to have a financial system that's holding beneath the waterline, basically. We can cure this, we can do it. I have noticed in my time, Bernard Leiter was mentioned, he told me a very interesting story about Rockefeller, who at the beginning of the 20th century had these Standard Oil concessions. You know, they didn't know what to do with the oil because there weren't many cars and no aeroplanes. So he decided that he would go to the medical research institutes of America and say, look, here's some free cash, you know, build a laboratory, but all you've got to do is study ways of getting medicine from oil. And then at the same time, he went to the individual states in the United States and said, hey guys, can you make it a law that in order to practice as a dispensing chemist, you have to have a diploma from one of my universities? And this was a brilliant financial and political design, according to his biographers, because of course what it did is it changed medicine in the United States from being something that was based on plant cures, on homeopathy, to what it is today, allopathy they call it. And it has become a commercial business in which you don't take the medicine to cure yourself, you take it in order to make the drug companies profit. Actually, they just prescribe it, so you can keep on taking it. The cure is out there very often, but you're not given it. And if you imagine that this can be done in the healthcare sector, which is so much smaller than the banking and monetary sector, then we have to be aware that there is an academic dimension to what we've discussed tonight. and that through the course of your education and the time in the city, if you work in it, you will only tend to see the ideas of the financial establishment. I know one of my teachers who wanted to study money creation at a major university here. The professor told him, well, I can't let you produce that kind of output here. We're financed by banks and they don't want to see that kind of output. And that is what he told them, quite matter-of-factly, not passionately, just, he wasn't Muslim, just. And we have to be aware that, to an extent, we have grown up in a milieu which is not in favour of the sort of paradigm that I'm proposing. It doesn't need to be an Islamic paradigm. You can take it or leave it or parts of it, but we have to have foundations of justice. If we don't, then we're not going to have a just result. And I'll just finish on this quotation, which I wanted to show at the end, and I usually do, because it's from a man I admire, from Thomas Jefferson, and I read a lot of his quotations. And if you listen to this, a quotation taken from his writings almost 200 years ago exactly, and he says, "If the American people ever allow the banks to control the issuance of their currency, first by inflation, then by deflation, the banks and corporations that grow up around them will deprive the people of all property until their children will wake up homeless on the continent their fathers occupied. The issuing power of money should be taken from the banks and restored to Congress and to the people to whom it belongs." It's a very powerful statement, but he's wrong in just one aspect, because he says if the American people ever allow it, and the fact is that today it's not the American people, it's the world that is lumbered with that monetary system. There are many things I'd like to queue up, many kinds of project finance I'd like to do, but I feel that if I'm carrying that kind of burden as a kind of foundation to my work, then I'm always going to be dealing with a side issue, a kind of sideshow, and we must address the main event. I'm sorry to focus on it, Brian, but I think it's the main event, and one day, like it or not, the people will know that it's the main event.
Thank you very much.